Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Western Flavors. Before we get into our new episode, let's recap the thrilling and emotional events from our last story. The final battle for Heartland is over. In the immediate aftermath of his victory over Nathan Price, Ty and his reunited family watched as authorities, coordinated by Val Stanton, swarmed the mountain fortress. After a final defiant attempt to paint himself as the victim, Nathan was arrested and taken away in handcuffs. The episode ended as the exhausted team finally returned to the Dude Ranch for a powerful and tearful reunion with the rest of the family, culminating in the beautiful moment Ty was finally able to hold his daughter Lindy in his arms. If you're enjoying this new season, please take a second to hit that like button and be sure to subscribe so you never miss a chapter. Now, today, the war is over, but the cost is immense. As the family comes together, they must begin the long and quiet journey of healing. The world had shrunk to the size of the small, muddy patch of gravel in the driveway of the Fairfield Dude Ranch. For Ty Borden, kneeling on the cold, damp ground, the entire universe was the feeling of his daughter's small, warm body clasped in his arms, her face buried in the crook of his neck. The distant, sweeping views of the foothills, the tear-streaked faces of his family, the low, mournful sigh of the wind through the pines, it was all a distant and muffled backdrop to the singular and overwhelming reality of her presence. He had come home. Jack's hand was a heavy and grounding weight on his shoulder, a silent and powerful current of a love and a pride and a profound and weary relief. The tableau held for a timeless moment, a frozen and sacred portrait of a family that had been shattered and was now, finally and miraculously, whole again. It was Lisa who, with her quiet and practical and deeply and maternal grace, finally broke the spell. Her own eyes were shining with unshed tears, but her voice was a gentle and steady and necessary anchor. "Let's get you all inside. You're soaked to the bone. You'll catch your death of a cold." The simple and ordinary words were a permission slip to move, to breathe, to begin the slow and awkward and beautiful process of coming back to life. Ty rose, his movements stiff and slow, his muscles a screaming chorus of aches and pains. But he did not let Lindy go. He scooped her up, her small legs wrapping instinctively around his waist, and held her tight against his chest as he walked, a man carrying the most precious and fragile and wonderful treasure in the entire world. They moved as a single, and huddled, an emotionally ragged unit from the cold and misty morning air and into the warm and welcoming and blessedly safe sanctuary of the main lodge. The scent of a wood smoke from the massive stone hearth, the warm and golden glow of the lamps, the familiar and comforting clutter of a home, it was a sensory balm to their frayed and overstimulated and exhausted nerves. The room was a swirling and chaotic and beautiful symphony of a quiet and emotional reunions. Lou, her own strong and capable and businesslike composure having completely and utterly crumbled, was wrapped in Peter's arms, her face buried in his chest, her shoulders shaking with a quiet and unburdened and deeply and relieved sobs. He just held her, his own eyes closed, his hand stroking her hair, a husband who had been to hell and back and had just finally found his way home to his wife. Lisa was fussing over Jack, her own face a mask of a fierce and protective love. She settled him into his favorite armchair by the fire, tucking a thick woolen blanket around his legs, her movements a quiet and constant and worried assessment of the frail and powerful old man who was the anchor of their entire world. He had collapsed when he saw the news of the fire, and the fear of that moment was still a raw and present thing for her. But Jack's eyes were not on the fire. They were on his family, all of them, together, and a slow and quiet and deeply and satisfied peace seemed to settle over his weathered features. The two other rescued men, Caleb and Scott, stood just inside the doorway, as if they were afraid to come any further into the warmth, into the light. They were men who had been living in a world of a gray and sterile and brutalist concrete, and the simple and ordinary comfort of this room was an overwhelming and almost painful thing. Caleb, who had spent weeks in a sensory deprivation bunker, just stood there, his gaze moving slowly around the room, taking in the colors, the textures, the faces of the people he loved, as if he were a man seeing the world for the very first time. Scott, whose own imprisonment had been a quieter and more psychological kind of a hell, was a stiller and more contained presence, but the profound and quiet relief in his eyes was a powerful and palpable thing. Ty carried Lindy to the large, comfortable sofa by the fire and sat down, his daughter still a warm and wonderful and living weight in his lap. He could not bring himself to let her go. He was a drowning man who had just finally found his life raft. Amy sat down beside them, her own body pressing against his, a silent and constant and deeply and loving presence. She reached out and gently brushed a stray piece of a damp hair from his forehead, her touch a simple and beautiful and profound act of a pure and wifely love. He turned his head and looked at her, at his wife, at this beautiful and brave and unbreakable woman who had fought her own and very different war, and in that one single and quiet look, a universe of a love and a gratitude and a shared and terrible and beautiful history passed between them. The war was over. The nightmare had ended, and for the first and brief and beautiful and sacred moment, they were not soldiers or survivors or fugitives. They were just a family, and they were home. The initial tidal wave of raw and overwhelming emotion slowly began to recede, leaving behind the quiet and intricate and deeply personal work of individual healing. The large, warm lodge, which had been a single, swirling vortex of a shared relief, now began to break apart into smaller, quieter eddies of a conversation, of a connection. It was a family, beginning the slow and painstaking process of piecing itself back together. Caleb stood by the roaring fire, a thick woolen blanket draped over his shoulders. He was not looking at the flames, he was feeling them. The radiant heat on his skin was a beautiful and almost painful and miraculous thing. For weeks, his entire world had been the cold and indifferent and seamless gray of a concrete box, a place where the only warmth was the fading memory of a life he had thought was lost forever. Now, he was here, surrounded by a wood and a stone and a love that was a physical and tangible and living presence. Tim approached him, not with a rush of words, but with the quiet and gruff and deeply and understanding solidarity of a man who had his own and very different collection of scars. He placed a heavy and gentle hand on Caleb's shoulder.
"It's good to have you back, son."
The simple words, spoken with a quiet and unadorned sincerity, were more powerful than any grand speech. Caleb just nodded, his throat too thick with a sudden and unexpected wave of an emotion to speak. Across the room, his eyes met Ashley's. She gave him a small and tired and beautiful smile, a silent and powerful and deeply and shared acknowledgement of the impossible journey they had just, once again, survived together. In another corner of the room, the two sisters who had been fighting their own and very different wars finally and truly found each other. Lou, who had been a general in a war of information, a relentless and tireless and brilliant fighter in the world of a media and a politics, finally and completely surrendered. The moment she was alone with Amy, the strong and capable and unbreakable facade she had maintained for weeks simply dissolved.
"I was so scared, Amy."
Her voice was a small and broken and childlike whisper. She clung to her younger sister, her body shaking with the aftershocks of a terror she had not allowed herself to feel until this very moment.
"When Peter was taken, and then you, I thought I had lost you all."
Amy, who had just been a prisoner herself, now became the protector, the comforter. She held her older sister, her own voice a steady and soothing and deeply and loving murmur.
"I'm here, Lou. We're all here. We're safe. You did it. You fought for us. You were so brave."
"No, you were the brave one, always."
They just held each other, two very different and equally strong women, their shared and sisterly love, a powerful and healing and unbreakable bond. Ty had finally and reluctantly let a sleeping Lindy be carried to one of the guest beds by Lisa. He stood, his back to the fire, watching the quiet and fractured and beautiful reunions unfold. He saw his family, battered and bruised and exhausted, but whole. He had done it. He had saved them. But the victory felt hollow, a ghost in his own heart, because he knew what it had cost. He felt a presence beside him, and he turned to see the man he had been both dreading and needing to face. Jack stood there, his own face a mask of a deep and profound and quiet pride. They did not speak for a long time. They just stood, side by side, watching the quiet and beautiful and heartbreaking tableau of their own and saved and broken family. It was Ty who, with a voice that was a raw and painful and deeply and ashamed whisper, finally broke the silence.
"I'm so sorry, Jack."
The words were a quiet and heavy and deeply and inadequate thing.
"Your home, your history, everything you and your family built. I burned it. I know why I did it, but it doesn't make it right."
Jack was quiet for a long moment, his gaze still fixed on the family before him. When he finally spoke, his voice was not the angry or the disappointed or the heartbroken voice that Ty had been expecting. It was a quiet and steady and deeply and philosophical and completely and utterly and forgiving sound.
It was a place, Ty, a beautiful place, a place full of memories, but it was just a place.
He finally turned to look at Ty. His own eyes, which had looked so frail just a few hours ago, were now shining with a clear and powerful and unwavering light.
Heartland was never about the wood. It was never about the stone. It's in us. It's in you. It's in that little girl sleeping in the other room. You stood in the heart of the fire, and you chose them. You chose life. You chose love. You didn't destroy Heartland, son. You saved it.
The words, a powerful and beautiful and deeply and necessary absolution, were a gift. The great and crushing weight of a guilt that Ty had been carrying since the moment he had struck that match, the weight that had been a poison in his soul, finally began to lift. He looked at the man who had been a father to him in every way that mattered, and for the first time since the fire, he allowed himself to feel not the shame of his actions, but the profound and deeply and honorable reason for them. He was not a destroyer. He was a protector, and he had done the right and the necessary and the beautiful thing. The quiet and healing atmosphere in the lodge was a fragile and temporary peace. They were a family in a bubble, a small and self-contained world of a shared trauma and a shared relief. But the outside world, the world that Nathan Price had so masterfully poisoned against them, had not gone away. It was waiting, just beyond the walls of their sanctuary. It was Peter who, with the calm and steady hand of a strategist, finally and gently burst the bubble. He had been a captive, a pawn in Nathan's game, but he was also a man who understood the language of a power, of a media, of a narrative. He knew that their long and public nightmare was far from over. He walked over to the large television, his expression one of a grim and necessary resolve. I think we need to see what they're saying. We need to know what we're up against. A new and heavy silence fell over the room. The intimate and fractured conversations died out. All eyes turned to the dark screen, a black and ominous mirror that was about to reflect their own and very public and very twisted story back at them. Peter picked up the remote, and with a quiet click, the world came rushing back in. The screen flickered to life, not with a regular program, but with the urgent and dramatic graphics of a breaking news special report. The face of a well-known and respected national news anchor filled the screen, her expression a mask of a serious and professional gravity. We are coming to you live with a breaking story that is developing by the minute, a story with bizarre and deeply troubling implications. Just a few hours ago, Canadian billionaire and philanthropist Nathan Price was taken into custody by the RCMP following a major and still unexplained incident at his private mountain estate west of Calgary. The family watched, their own breath held in a collective and anxious suspense. This was it, the truth. The screen cut to the now familiar and shaky helicopter footage of the fortress, of the RCMP vehicles, of Nathan being led away in handcuffs. But the anchor's next words were not the clean and simple declaration of a justice they had been hoping for. The official charges are stunning. Sources high up in the investigation have confirmed to this network that Mr. Price is being held on multiple counts of kidnapping, but the details surrounding this arrest are where this story takes a truly baffling turn. Also present at the scene was Ty Borden. The anchor's voice was laced with a professional and deeply and journalistic confusion. She was a woman who was trying to reconcile two completely contradictory narratives in a real time. The man, as you know, who is the subject of a nationwide manhunt for the arson that destroyed the historic Heartland Ranch. The footage you are seeing now, captured just a few weeks ago, shows a hooded figure, a figure the authorities have identified as Borden, at the scene of that fire. Ty's wanted photo, the grainy and monstrous still from the news helicopter, flashed on the screen beside the anchor's head. Lindy, who had been dozing on the sofa, stirred at the change in the room's atmosphere. Amy instinctively pulled the blanket a little higher around her daughter, a small and futile gesture to shield her from the poison that was filling the air.
They're still running with it. After everything, they're still painting him as the villain.
Her voice was a low and disbelieving and deeply and frustrated whisper. The media war she had fought so hard from her lonely Vancouver outpost had been a single and powerful battle, but it had clearly not been enough to win the war for the truth. The anchor continued, her own confusion a perfect reflection of the story's chaotic and contradictory nature. Nose anchor, how these two events are connected, how a beloved public figure like Nathan Price ends up a suspect in a kidnapping plot, and how the country's most wanted fugitive ends up at the center of that same investigation. That is the mystery that law enforcement and the entire country are now struggling to unravel. We are getting reports of Mr. Price's legal team alleging that he was in fact the victim of a home invasion and that this is all a part of an elaborate and vindictive campaign against him by the Bartlett Fleming family, a family with whom, as we have recently learned, the Price family has a long and contentious history.
Son of a bitch. He's still doing it. He's still pulling the strings, even from a jail cell.
Tim was on his feet, his own face a mask of a dark and impotent rage. He looked from the screen to Ty, his own heart breaking for the man who had just saved them all, only to be tried and convicted all over again on a national television. The report ended, cutting to a commercial break, but the damage was done. The truth had not set them free. It had just made their prison, the prison of a public opinion, a more complex and more confusing and more insidious, kind of a cage. The initial and simple relief of Nathan's arrest was now gone, replaced by the cold and sobering and deeply and frustrating reality of the long and public and very, very ugly fight that lay ahead. They were no longer fighting a man. They were fighting his story, and they were just beginning to understand how powerful and how resilient a well-told lie could be. The toxic residue of the news report hung in the air of the lodge, a chilling and invisible poison. The brief and fragile sense of a homecoming had been tainted by the harsh and public reality of their new battle. Ty stood motionless, the reflection of his own monstrous wanted photo still echoing in his mind, the weight of Jack's absolution now competing with the crushing weight of the world's condemnation. Amy watched him, her heart aching, but her gaze was also on her daughter. Lindy was sitting up on the sofa, the blanket clutched to her chest, her small face a mask of a quiet confusion and a dawning fear. She was too young to understand the words, the legal complexities, but she was an expert in the language of an emotion, and she could feel the familiar and terrifying chill of a new danger seeping back into their lives. Amy knew she had to get them both away from this, away from the news, away from the strategy, away from the war. She stood up, her movement a quiet and purposeful and deeply and maternal decision.
I think it's past someone's bedtime.
She walked over and gently took Lindy's hand, her smile a small and reassuring and protective shield. She looked at Ty, her eyes conveying a silent and loving and deeply and understanding message. Come with us. He followed, a man moving in a trance, grateful for the escape, for the quiet and non-negotiable command of his wife. She led them away from the tense and worried council in the main room, down a quiet wood-paneled corridor and into one of the guest rooms. It was a simple and comfortable space with a large soft bed and a single warm lamp that cast a gentle golden glow. It was a sanctuary, an island of a peace in their stormy sea. Amy tucked Lindy into the bed, pulling the thick patchwork quilt up to her chin. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hand stroking her daughter's hair. Ty stood by the door, a hesitant and uncertain figure, a stranger in this quiet and intimate and sacred space of a fatherhood he was still just learning how to reclaim. Lindy looked past her mother, her wide and serious blue eyes finding his. Her voice was a small and quiet and incredibly and fragile whisper. Mommy said you were being a hero. She said you were fighting a bad man so he couldn't hurt us anymore. The simple and trusting and powerful words were a direct hit to Ty's already battered heart. He looked at Amy, and he saw in her eyes the memory of the promise she had been forced to make, the story she had been forced to tell to a little girl who had woken up to find her father gone all over again.
Your mom is the real hero.
His own voice was a rough and emotional and deeply and humble rasp. He finally moved, crossing the room and sitting on the other side of the bed, his weight causing the mattress to dip. He was close enough now to see the small and fading scar on her forehead from a fall she'd taken when she was 4, a memory he had not been there to make. The guilt was a fresh and sharp and terrible pain. Did you get him? Is the bad man gone for good?
Yes, sweetie, he's gone. He can't ever hurt us again, I promise.
And are you staying home now? For good? The question, the one that had been a silent and terrified and unspoken thing in the heart of the entire family, was finally and simply and beautifully asked. Ty looked at his daughter, at her beautiful and innocent and hopeful face. He saw the flicker of her old fear in her eyes, the fear of the little girl who had run through the ranch frantically and desperately, searching for the father who had broken his promise and left her in the middle of the night. And he knew that this one single promise was the most important one he would ever make in his entire life. He reached out and took her small hand in his own large and calloused and bruised hand completely engulfing hers.
Yes, I am staying home. I am never ever leaving you again. I am going to be right here for your first day of a school and your last day of a school. I'm going to be here to teach you how to drive a truck. I am going to be here to scare away every single boy who ever tries to break your heart. I am here, and I am not going anywhere. Ever.
His voice was a quiet and steady and solemn and unbreakable vow. And in that moment, the last of the fear in Lindy's eyes finally and completely and beautifully dissolved, replaced by a smile so pure and so bright that it was like watching the sun rise. Amy sat on the other side of the bed, a silent and tearful and deeply and grateful witness to the quiet and sacred and beautiful miracle of her own, and saved and broken, and now finally and truly and completely and whole family. The promise she had made to her daughter, the promise that her father was a hero, had been kept, and the promise he had just made, the promise of a future, was the one that would, from this moment on, be the new and true and unbreakable foundation of their entire world. Lindy's eyes began to droop, the sheer and emotional exhaustion of the last few days finally and completely overwhelming her. She fell asleep, her small hand still held safely and firmly in her father's. Ty and Amy sat in the quiet and lamplit room, two silent guardians, watching their daughter sleep. The war was not over. The world outside was still a dangerous and hostile place. But in here, in this small and quiet and sacred space, there was only a peace. There was only a love. And for the first time in a very, very long time, there was a real and tangible and beautiful and unbreakable hope. The small guest room was an island of a profound and blessedly ordinary peace. Ty and Amy sat on either side of their sleeping daughter for what felt like hours, two silent guardians watching over the most precious thing in their world. The frantic and violent rhythm of the last few weeks, the running, the hiding, the fighting, it all seemed to fade away in the quiet and steady and gentle rhythm of Lindy's breathing. This was what they had been fighting for. This simple and sacred and beautiful quiet. Slowly, inevitably, the tide of a pure and bone-deep exhaustion began to pull the rest of the family under. The adrenaline that had kept them all running, all fighting, all worrying, had finally and completely run its course, leaving behind a profound and deeply and human need for a rest. They found their sanctuaries where they could. Caleb, the man who had been a caged animal in a concrete box, did not even make it to a bed. He simply collapsed into a large, comfortable armchair by the dying embers of the fire, a thick woolen blanket pulled up to his chin, and fell into a deep and dreamless and profoundly and deservedly peaceful sleep. Tim, his own and restless and angry energy finally spent, was a long and sprawled and snoring form on one of the large sofas. Lou and Peter, their own and quiet and deeply and emotional reunion complete, disappeared into one of the other guest rooms, a husband and a wife, finally and truly and safely together again. Scott, the quiet and steady and intellectual heart of their group, found a quiet corner and simply sat, his eyes closing, a man finally at a rest. The Dude Ranch, a place that had been a sanctuary of a worry, was now a sanctuary of a pure and exhausted and beautiful sleep. But for Ty, sleep would not come. His mind, which had been a sharp and tactical and focused weapon for so long, was now a restless and chaotic and untamed thing. It replayed the events of the last few days, the last few weeks, the last 4 years, in a frantic and jumbled and unending loop. The fire, Nathan's cold and evil smile, Amy's terrified and brave face, his friends being dragged away into the darkness, and Lindy, always and forever, Lindy. He finally and carefully extracted his hand from his daughter's sleeping grasp and slipped out of the room, his movements the silent and practiced grace of a ghost. He needed air. He needed space. He needed to see the sky. He walked through the quiet and sleeping lodge, a solitary and watchful figure in the deep and pre-dawn darkness. He pushed open the heavy main door and stepped out onto the wide and wrap-around porch. The world outside was a different country. The storm had passed completely, leaving behind a sky that was a deep and inky and impossibly and beautifully clear black, a velvet canvas that was studded with a million and brilliant and diamond-like stars. The air was cold and clean and carried the sweet and damp scent of a rain-washed pine and a wet earth. It was the smell of home. He walked to the railing and looked out, not at the familiar and comforting view of the Dude Ranch, but east, towards the distant and dark and now completely and utterly and heartbreakingly invisible silhouette of the land where Heartland had once stood. The place was gone. The symbol of his own and hard-won salvation was a pile of a cold and wet ash. But Jack's words, his powerful and healing and deeply and necessary absolution, echoed in his heart. You didn't destroy Heartland, son. You saved it. He was not a destroyer. He was a husband, a father, a protector, and he had done what he had to do. The war was not over. He knew that. The long and ugly and public fight for their name, for their legacy, for their very truth was just beginning. But the other war, the one that had been raging in his own soul for 4 long and terrible years, the war against the ghosts of his past, that war was finally and blessedly over. He was not a victim anymore. He knew who he was, and he was home. He heard the soft and familiar creak of the door behind him, and he did not have to turn to know who it was. Amy came and stood beside him, a silent and comforting and deeply and understanding presence. She did not speak. She simply wrapped a large and warm and woolen blanket around both of their shoulders, a simple and beautiful and profound gesture that said everything that needed to be said. They stood there, together in the cold and quiet and pre-dawn darkness, 2 separate and battered souls, now a single and unified and unbreakable whole. They watched as the first and faint and pale and hopeful and gray light of a dawn began to seep into the eastern sky, a slow and beautiful and inexorable tide, pushing back the darkness. The long and terrible night was over. They were battered, they were bruised, they were for all intents and purposes homeless, but they were together, all of them, and for the first time in 4 long and impossibly and difficult years, the path forward, the long road back home, was a difficult and uncertain and beautiful thing, and it was, finally and truly and completely clear.